Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 358. In this episode, we're continuing our journey through the fall of Númenor by exploring the reign of Tar-Palantir and the Númenorian civil war that occurred during his reign. Before we get started, I'd like to give a double up air five to our amazing fellowship. Stick 'em up, fellowship. 3, 2, 1. Whoopsh. Very nice. Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, SaberSystems, Melkor27, and KG. Also, a shout out to those celebrating their fellowship anniversary in December of 2023, Andrew T., Katie W., Brian O. the First, Emilio P, Margaret L., Shannon S., Zeke F. Thank you all so much for sticking with us over the years. Join the Fellowship of the Road by visiting patreon.com/TolkienRoad. When you join the Fellowship of the Road, it helps us to keep on evering on and land you some cool perks along the way. Learn more at patreon.com/TolkienRoad. If you're watching, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. Finally, attention binge listeners, subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the platform of your choice. If you are a 5-star fan of the Tolkien Road, you can really help us out by heading over to iTunes or your preferred source for the show and dropping us a rating and review. When you do that, it helps get the word out about the Tolkien Road, which helps us to keep on evering on. Okay, in this episode, we learn of the reign of Tar-Palantir, the penultimate king of Númenor, who sought to return the land of Gift to its ancient ways. We'll also learn of the rise of his nephew Pharazôn, and the beginning of the abominable reign that ultimately leads to the downfall of the land of Gift. The original sources for this portion are primarily Unfinished Tales, Lord of the Rings Appendices, Akalabaith, and The People of Middle-earth, which is the History of Middle-earth, Volume 12. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about Tar-Palantir, shall we? So Tar-Palantir lived from 3035 of the Second Age to 3255 of the Second Age, so lived to be 220 years old. He reigned from 3175 to 3255, 80 years. And just a minor point, he may have actually acceded, taken the throne in 3177. There's a footnote in there that kind of deals with the discrepancy there, but 3175, 3177, both pretty close together. If you're interested in the details of that, you can check out the footnote. I won't go into it right here. His Adunaic name was Enziladun, which means the flower of the west. But he returned to the custom of taking a name in Quenya, right? So he took the name Tar-Palantir, taking again a title in the Elven tongue, which was symbolic of his reign. He who looks afar, that's what Tar-Palantir or Palantir means, he who looks afar. Of course, we hear Palantir and we rightly think of the Seeing Stones, right? The Seeing Stones that are play an important role in the story of the Lord of the Rings. We've actually done there's a whole section and a whole chapter in Unfinished Tales about the Palantiri, those Seeing Stones, and kind of the whole story of where they came from and that sort of thing. And we've done an episode on that, a long time ago. But literally, his name means the same thing as what the name of those stones means, which are the things that see afar. He who sees afar, these stones that see afar, right? And maybe the most important thing about Tar-Palantir is that he repented of the ways of the kings before him, turning again to the ancient customs that began in the early days of Númenor. Really, he tried to turn the ship, as it were, right? He tried to change course back to the way they had been going before the last several kings. He kind of saw that they were, on this rapid decline. They were heading for trouble, and he tried to turn them back to the ways that had really been the founding of Númenor. Most importantly, friendship with the Eldar and the Lords of the West, right? But also, as we'll see, attention to that ultimate calling to have some form of communion with Eru Ilúvatar, which is represented by the worship on the Mental Tarma. But we'll come back to that in just a moment. There is, just to come back to that name Palantir for a second, in the very first paragraph here, we have this line, and even those that hated him feared his words as those of a true seer. he was far-sighted both in eye and mind. So it's not just about that he was like far-sighted, that he liked to go out and look at the ocean and like, look afar, try to see if he could spot, any glimmer of light from the, from the west. But it was that he was far-sighted in mind and spirit. He understood that, because of the ways that they had adopted in Númenor, that they were heading for trouble. And even when somebody, you may not like somebody, but they have, that they're wise, that they have the ability to kind of understand the way things are moving. Even then, you still want to pay attention to them, even if you don't like them very much for the things they're saying. So, that's the kind of person he was. That's why he took this name, Tar-Palantir. All right. Well, let's read a little bit, a very key paragraph about the nature of his reign. He gave peace for a while to the faithful, and he went once more at due seasons to the hollow of Eru upon the Meneltarma, which Argimilzur had forsaken. The white tree he tended again with honor, and he prophesied, saying that when the tree perished, then also would the line of the kings come to its end. But his repentance was too late to appease the anger of the Valar and the insolence of his fathers, of which the greater part of his people did not repent. And Emiel K, the king's brother, was strong and ungentle, and following the ways of Argimilzur, he took the leadership of those that had been called the king's men, and opposed the will of his brother as openly as he dared, and yet more in secret. Thus the days of Tar-Palantir became darkened with grief, and he would spend much of his time in the west, and there ascended often the ancient tower of King Ministir upon the hill of Oromet nigh to Andunier, whence he gazed westward in yearning, hoping to see, maybe, some sail upon the sea. But no ship came ever again from the west to Númenor, and Avalane was veiled in cloud. So despite his best attempts to return Númenor to its roots, to the great tradition that it inherited, it really seems like it's a little bit too little too late, right? It's too little too late. So that's, kind of an interesting point, which we'll have to, maybe think about and deal with a little bit. But a couple of just key points, it had been a few generations of kings now that had not gone to the Hollow of Eru upon the Meneltarma and carried out these sacred rituals. And then he again tends the white tree. So the white tree being the symbol of friendship with the Blessed Realm, with the elves and the Lords of the West. So he's tending to all of these things again in the hope that maybe he can turn Númenor back to its ways of old. But then again, he's got this brother, unfortunately, who is much more of a mind with their father, and keeping with this false tradition, right? The turning away from the great traditions that founded Númenor. And then this brother is working against him, really in secret, but also, as much in the open as he can. He's not really making it a secret, even though he might not be as in your face about it, as he'd like to be. Now, that seems to be a little bit of the nature of the Civil War. We get this line, the entry in the Tale of Years says, Repentance of Tar-Palantir, Civil War in Númenor. But we don't get a lot of details about what exactly that Civil War looks like, other than we just get the sense that there are these two parties. The King's Men, who are the ones who are rebellious, even though in this era they wouldn't really be the King's Men, they'd be the King's Brothers' men, if you will. And then we have, the Lords of Andunier, right? The faithful who want to go back to the ways and maintain the ways that had founded Númenor. So we suppose that this great civil war is between these two parties, but we don't really get much details about like the battles fought or anything like that. It could be that it's not so much like, a great civil war of arms, but maybe a cold civil war, right? Like, just like a lot of intrigue and that kind of thing between ruling parties. But nevertheless, these are the two parties that we're talking about within the reign of Tar-Palantir. Okay. He spent much of his days in Andunier. So let's look again and see where Andunier is. So here's our map of Númenor. Andunier being on the far west coast, northwest coast of Númenor, which means that it faces towards the Blessed Realm. So right here, there's Andunier, and it's going to be a great place to look for the elves who are hopefully coming from the Blessed Realm, although none do during this reign. And Avalonier, it says, was veiled in cloud, meaning this city that was on Tol Eressëa, right? Kind of the city that they could once before, or in times past, they could see the light of this city, on a clear day if the conditions were just right. Well, there's none of that at this point. It's veiled in cloud at this point. And the big question I have in my mind is, could Tar-Palantir have done any more to right the ship, as it were? I don't know. I'm curious as to what you all think, but I mean, at some point, you're just kind of like, well, why didn't his efforts to turn back, save Númenor, right? Why couldn't they have saved Númenor? And maybe if there'd been a couple more generations of his kind of reign, it would have. But then again, it's just this really interesting kind of question of of fate, right? What is fate on a grand scale? What is fate on like the everyday historical scale? Can you turn back a civilization that has strayed so far from its roots, from its really good and just roots? Can you actually turn it back once that train is kind of moving full speed in a certain direction? And I don't know. I mean, I think it's kind of doubtful. I think if history proves anything, that it's fairly doubtful that you actually can. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that civilization once stood for is going to be gone and lost forever. But it's just not going to ever, there will come a time where that civilization is really done for as that civilization, but maybe the remnants of it move on and do other things, and some of them kind of get back to that tradition that was good in the first place. But I'll offer some more thoughts on that in my closing thoughts for this episode. We learn about the death of his brother Emiel K and the rise of his brother's son Pharazôn. Though Emiel K died before him, his son Pharazôn was perhaps even more of a plague to Tar-Palantir. So there were some really interesting little remarks that I had not been aware of before that came up in this chapter regarding Pharazôn and Míriel. Míriel being the only child and daughter of Tar-Palantir. So let's read this description of Tar-Palantir. Let's read the description of Pharazôn. Pharazôn had fared often abroad as a leader in the wars that the Númenorians made then in the coastlands of Middle-earth, seeking to extend their dominion over men, and thus he had won great renown as a captain both by land and by sea. Therefore, when he came back to Númenor, hearing of his father's death, the heart of the people were turned to him, for he brought with him great wealth, and was for the time free in his giving. Now, I'm going to offer some quick thoughts on the depiction of Pharazôn in The Rings of Power, the Amazon TV show, because I really think that Amazon, amongst many other things, quite honestly, you can see all my reviews of season 1, but I really think they missed the mark when it came to this particular character, Pharazôn. First of all, and this is no slight against the actor per se, the actor really did a fine job. I just don't think they cast the part well. So it's not so much the actor's fault as it is the showrunners and the casting directors, right? Very important figure, and they just didn't get him right. First of all, the writing of the character. So we meet Pharazôn when he looks like he's kind of an old man. Like, he's not an old man, but he's not like this like young, just full of vigor, kind of captain of men who looks very powerful. Just a really imposing figure. And I go here to the paragraph that came right before this. It says, Elintir, the brother of Amandio, loved Míriel, but when first she saw Pharazôn in the splendor of his young manhood, and when Pharazôn was greeted upon the steps of the house, her eyes and her heart were turned to him for his beauty and for his wealth also. And Pharazôn went away, and Míriel remained unwed. So I had never read that passage before. It is from, let me just double check here. I believe it is from the History of Middle Earth Volume 12. So there's lots of great snippets like this in the various History of Middle Earth volumes, but this is really interesting to me, and it's just another one of those things where it's like, if they had kind of taken that into account, and I get it, it's not necessarily that they can, they didn't have the rights necessarily to a lot of things, but who's to say they couldn't have just said well, we're going to go this direction. It just so happens to coincide with what's in this. That would have been a really cool thing. But think about, so the only thing I'd known about the relationship of Pharazôn and Miriel was it was completely against Miriel's will, almost like Miriel just didn't want to have anything to do with him. But it's interesting to think that when they were younger and Pharazôn was this great captain of, of the Númenóreans, that Miriel had actually, almost she had a chance to marry somebody else who was of the House of the Faithful, right? Elintir, but she had this infatuation with Pharazôn, right? Who happened to be her first cousin. I mean, you're getting into very kind of Game of Thrones-ish territory here with, kind of increasingly, just maybe salacious details. But I think that would have been a really interesting kind of story arc to say that Miriel had this kind of somewhat naughty, illicit infatuation with her first cousin when she was younger. But it wasn't maybe it wasn't necessarily of a salacious nature, but just a deep kind of admiration, kind of the fawning admiration. But as she grows and sees who he is, she starts to realize that he's not a good guy. But then he knows that she had this fawning admiration for him, and he takes that and uses it against her, and takes her to wife against her will, which is what actually happens in Akallabêth, right? So, I think there was an opportunity missed there to kind of tell this story from when both characters were much younger. But even in Rings of Power, they don't really seem to be of the same generation. Pharazôn kind of seems to be this old man, again, not like an elderly man, but just an older man. And Miriel seems to be kind of what late 20s, early 30s. Pharazôn seems like he's kind of mid 50s, right? And he doesn't seem like a very kind of powerful captain of a man. He seems kind of like this conniving, lordly sort of figure, but not necessarily just like this captain of a man who just walks around and does whatever he wills, right? Just this strong will. And the other way they really missed the boat with this is that it's clear that Pharazôn and Amandil were very close friends. And Amandil is the father of Elendil. And so when Elendil shows up in the Rings of Power, and Pharazôn has no idea who he is, and Miriel has no idea who he is, that's just not possible, right? They would have known who Elendil was because of this close friendship of Pharazôn and Amandil. So Elintir, we don't get anything of this love triangle in the story between Elintir and Miriel and Pharazôn. But, and I just think that's a huge missed opportunity amongst many missed opportunities with the show. So anyway, I digress. Feel free to share your thoughts on my thoughts in the comments below. But nevertheless, I think it's something that could have been, made the story that much better in the telling via the Rings of Power. Okay, so we'll jump ahead now to the death of Tar-Palantir and Pharazôn seizing the scepter from Miriel. So it's really interesting that Miriel seems to have been attracted to Pharazôn earlier, but now is taken to wife by him against her will. We do see that, that I struggled with how to reconcile that. I think I kind of explained it already to you all, how you might reconcile it, that, when she was younger, it was kind of this innocent fawning, look at this great captain of a man, and then Pharazôn being kind of evil-hearted, having an evil will, uses that for his own power, to gain power. But really this taking of a woman against her will first, and second of all, being the first cousin, which was against the explicit law in Númenor. these kind of combine to be this first great abominable evil done by Pharazôn, but it's certainly not the last. So, we're getting to the reign of our Pharazôn here, and this is when it all begins to go downhill. Just a quick note on the image that opens this chapter. It's a pencil sketch, Tar-Palantir upon the Meneltarma, is what I believe this is. So this is Tar-Palantir attempting to lead the Númenóreans back to the worship of Eru Iluvatar, but unfortunately, maybe too little too late. You can see the other figures in the background, by the way, and that kind of indicates that, he's leading them up here in this great procession as it was supposed to be. All right, well, sometimes even the right actions are too little too late, and this is the tragedy of human evil, that even when the good arise in dark times, it may not be enough to hold back the overwhelming tide of destruction, depravity, and horror. That seems to be the story of Tar-Palantir, a king who did all that he perhaps could to right the ship of Númenor, but was already sunk under the weight of his forefathers' rebellion and despair. Still, this is a Tolkienian story we're talking about, so even though the greatest of earthly kingdoms should fall, somehow there is always a glimmer of hope and a realization that the shadow is indeed only a passing thing. In the next episode, we'll plunge into the era of iniquity that begins with the reign of our Pharazôn, the last king of Númenor. We're on the final leg of our journey through the fall of Númenor, so stay tuned. All right, well, let's hit some correspondence real quick. All right. So this is in response to episode 317, my original review of the fall of Númenor. This is from Onphalos Herdsman. The idea is amazing, but the final result, not so much. He should have gathered absolutely everything there is about the Second Age. Why on earth make an appendix summary of the Third Age and leave behind the Notion Club papers in Tal Elmar? Makes no sense. It's like, okay, we have most of Second Age in one book, but a few more things not included. Why? I think that's a reasonable criticism. I think overall the book is a big success. I spent most of this year going through it on the Tolkien Road podcast, but I certainly agree that I think I'm kind of curious as to why the Notion Club papers were left off. Also, thank you for mentioning Tal Elmar. I was not even aware that story existed until your comment, quite honestly. Yeah, it just shows you the depth of all of these various odds and ends that are out there. And I'm delighted to know that there is this other kind of flavor of Númenor and the Second Age, Middle Earth and the Second Age story that exists out there. And definitely one that I'm going to add to the list for next year and hopefully come back to in the not too distant future. So very much appreciate you pointing that out. I too agree he should have kept it there. Maybe the answer is simply that the publisher was like, let's not publish everything. So we want people to go by some of the history of Middle Earth too. And people will. So anyway, that's my kind of cynical guess as to why they were left off. But overall, I at the end of the day, I'm very appreciative of the work Brian Sibley did in compiling all of this here. And it's would I've liked to get those two other things included here. Would have been convenient, but if you're really that upset, then just go out and buy Volume 5 and Volume 12 of the History of Middle Earth. All right, as always, keep the correspondence coming. We'll do our best to respond to you somehow and at some point. Don't forget to stop by TrueMistPress.com for great merch like super styling and comfy Tolkien Road t-shirts, Two Trees camper mugs, and signed copies of my books. Once again, that's TrueMistPress.com. Thanks for supporting our work with your purchase. And thank you to our amazing patrons, especially the following: John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, SaberSystems, Melkor27, KG, Emilio P, Jonathan D, Richard K, Robert H, Paul D, Julia, Werty, JoeBagelMan, Matt R, John W, Eugene D, Alaskan Moose 31, Chris B, Daniel S, Cory C, Carolyn S, Emiel K, Seb M, and Brian O II, Ms. Anonymous, Andrew T, Redhawk, Shannon S, Brian O I, Zeke F, James L, Chris L, Asya V, Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C, David of Pints with Jack, and Eric B. All right. Well, thanks everybody. I truly appreciate the fellowship. Thank you all so much for your support. And thanks to everybody for watching and or listening. We will talk at you next time. Bye-bye.